You wouldn't say something as troublesome as inheriting now after being out of touch for 23 years, would you?
The woman who claimed to be my father's remarriage partner was very assertive. She insisted that the inheritance of my deceased father, whom she had taken care of until the end, belonged to her. Of course, I had no objections. I didn't want a single yen of the inheritance from my father who had abandoned me, his daughter.
Hurry up and sign that paper. Abandon the inheritance officially.
At that moment, my grandfather stopped me from signing as prompted. His eyes were burning with intense anger as he stared at my father's remarriage partner. My name is Sarah. I'm 29 years old. Since graduating from university, I've been working as an administrative assistant at an insurance agency. I'm in my late 20s, unmarried, and have no boyfriend. It's not that I don't want to get married, but I just can't bring myself to date men. The reason is simple: I have a distrust of men. The cause lies with my father. My father David disappeared 23 years ago after leaving me with my grandfather. The reason was probably my mother's death. My mother died in a traffic accident when I was 5 years old and my father was 35 years old. According to my grandfather, my father was so depressed that he couldn't hear the voices around him. Perhaps he lost confidence in living together, so he left me with his parents and disappeared.
Sarah did nothing wrong. Poor thing. You can rely on your grandparents.
I still can't forget the sad expression on my grandfather's face at that time. However, strangely enough, I can't remember what kind of face my father left me with. I think I wanted to forget the existence of my father who abandoned me as soon as possible. It was about 5 years after that when I heard a rumor that my father had remarried. The estrangement between me and my father lasted for 23 years. The only thing I truly believed in was the love of my grandparents and deceased mother. To be honest, I hated my father from the bottom of my heart. The fact that I was a child abandoned by his parents tormented me deeply. It was especially painful when I was in elementary and junior high school because there were only families with both parents around me. I have been teased or harassed for not having parents many times. There were times when I got into a big fight with someone and my grandparents were called out.
You were teased for not having parents? That's their fault. Sorry, Sarah. You're the only one who has a hard time. Grandpa and Grandma are always on your side.
Even such kind grandparents have been angry with me before. It was because I was much worse at controlling my emotions than now. I still can't forget the self-hatred at that time. Because I felt pathetic and regretted being abandoned, I hated my father even more. There are countless unpleasant things that children do when they don't have parents. Among them, it is particularly easy to understand the feeling of alienation felt on Father's Day or Mother's Day. As part of recreation, there were times when we drew portraits of our parents. There were also classmates who prepared presents happily on their parents' birthdays or wedding anniversaries. At such times, kind classmates left me alone. That kindness made me feel even more painful, but who should I complain to? Gradually, I became more isolated. What was fortunate for me without parents was that the grandparents who took me in were relatively wealthy. My grandfather is a former lawyer and is still relied upon by people in the area even now that he is old. My grandmother is always kind and good at cooking, and she treated me, who had no cuteness, very carefully.
You don't have to worry about money. You can do any hobby you want, and if you ever want to go to college, Grandpa and Grandma will help you properly.
Instead of directly venting anger at my father, I had all the love of my grandparents as much as I wanted. I wanted anything I wanted and sometimes said something outrageous. A rational grandfather didn't spoil me like that.
Grandpa can only buy what you need for Sarah. If you just want something, you can't buy it for you. It's not because Grandpa is stingy that he says this kind of thing. It's because Grandpa doesn't want Sarah to become an adult who spends money recklessly.
Grandfather is really a solid person. He is really kind, but not always so. He could be very strict at times and wouldn't forgive me for being spoiled. I often felt lonely when I went out with my grandparents. On holidays, when we went shopping at commercial facilities, there were family members everywhere you looked. Children who listened to their whimsical requests. Siblings who get along well by obediently listening to each other's words. Parents and children who enjoy the same game at the game center. Couples who look happily at their healthy children. Even though I had grandparents, there were no parents around me. Commercial facilities were places that confronted me with such reality. Why only me? There were many times when I felt such thoughts. There are many people in the world who live under worse conditions than mine. Although it was understood in my head, there was no way to fill the loneliness or pain unique to myself alone. My grandparents understood well the unbearable pain that I had. One day, my grandfather made me such a proposal.
If Sarah really wants to, she can use the foster care system. You can live with a couple of the same age as your real parents as a family. However,
my grandfather cut off his words and shed tears. It was the first time I had seen my grandfather cry.
Grandpa and Grandma really care about Sarah and love her very much. If you say you're in pain, you have to withdraw. Honestly, even talking about this is painful. But if it's for you.
My grandfather couldn't speak until the end. Rather, I didn't let him speak. I'm not going to leave Grandpa and Grandma behind, am I? Don't ever talk about adoption again. My home is here. This place where Grandpa and Grandma are is my place. If I just kept grieving, my grandparents would feel sad too. The time has come for me to face myself firmly. I thought so strongly. I accepted myself as a child abandoned by my parents and still lived positively. Thanks to the abundant love of my grandparents, I had become strong before I knew it. The passing of my grandmother due to illness was 20 years after my father abandoned me. It had been a long time since I had to say goodbye to someone so close. I was extremely sad, but my grandfather was calm and collected. He even had the composure to comfort me. I felt puzzled that my grandfather, who should have been the one grieving the most, was so composed.
I was prepared for this day to come someday. We talked a lot while we were still alive and were ready to say goodbye. That's why I'm surprised at how well I'm holding up. It's strange.
My grandparents' parting was very peaceful. Everyone in the family praised their parting as something they would want for themselves, and I was proud too. While my grandmother was being cremated, one of my aunts approached me with an apologetic look on her face.
I'm sorry to bring this up at a time like this,
she said, and showing me a picture of a man and asking if I would consider marriage. She knew it would be frowned upon, but she brought it up anyway. She looked genuinely sorry about it. Surprisingly, my grandfather smiled when he heard about it.
That's great news. You should definitely consider it. Think of your aunt's feelings.
My grandfather said that, but I couldn't feel the same way. Because of the painful experience of being abandoned by my father, I had become distrustful of men. While I admired the kind of relationship my grandparents had, I couldn't bring myself to hope for marriage. In my heart, such an intractable dilemma had taken shape. 3 years after my grandmother's passing, my grandfather approached me with a serious look on his face and said he had something to tell me.
David seems to have passed away in the hospital.
It was then that I learned for the first time that my father had been seriously ill. In fact, my grandfather had been in touch with him through his lawyer friends in recent years. The news of his death also came from those lawyer friends.
I heard that the funeral is the day after tomorrow. I'm going to go. What about you, Sarah?
After thinking about it, I decided not to attend the funeral. I didn't ask for any details like the address. My grandfather said he would leave it up to me. My father and I had cut ties 23 years ago. I don't have any hatred left for him now, but I don't feel like mourning him either. The next day, my grandfather took the train to visit his deceased son. I, who was left behind, reflected on the fact that I had no parents. There was no point in blaming my mother who had passed away in an accident. On the other hand, I still feel dissatisfied with my father's decision to leave me with my grandparents and cut off contact. It's just so pathetic for a person to leave their child's upbringing to their parents and cut off contact. I don't know what he was thinking, but couldn't he have done something else? A few years later, he remarried another woman. I can hardly understand it. But then again, I think to myself that there are fathers out there who are worse than mine. Fathers who are abusive, addicted to gambling or alcohol, antisocial, criminals. Compared to such monstrous fathers, maybe my father wasn't so bad after all. After all, for these past 23 years, he has never caused me any direct trouble. From the fact that he secretly communicated with my grandfather through a third party without telling me, it is clear that my father actively and thoroughly avoided any communication with me. He erased his own existence so as not to trouble my heart. Maybe that was his way of showing sincerity towards me. When I was 5 years old, I felt that my father was an awkward and unsociable person even though I was just a child. Until the very end, my father was just as I had imagined him back then. I now regret that I never heard his thoughts from his own mouth. After my father's funeral, a woman I didn't know visited me. She was probably in her 40s and had a very strong personality with distinctive heavy makeup.
You're Sarah, right? I knew it right away. You look a lot like David.
I had an intuition that she was my father's new wife. The woman named Taylor handed me some documents.
I came here today to ask you to renounce your inheritance, Sarah.
According to Taylor, my father had about 20 million yen in savings. If things continue as they were, Taylor and I would split the savings in half. She said that was unacceptable.
Don't you think so? I took care of David until the end, so it's only natural that I should get his money.
She said it was ridiculous for someone who hadn't been in touch for years to suddenly claim their rights. Yes, I understand, I replied. But if you don't mind, could you tell me what kind of life my father led?
What kind of life? It was a boring everyday life. He didn't drink or smoke. He didn't play pachinko, slots, or horse racing. He either read books all day or sat in front of his computer writing articles.
My father worked as a writer and would write anything if asked to do so: internet news, SEO articles, novels, scenarios. Even when he became bedridden due to illness in his later years, he continued writing. I was struck by an unexpected feeling. A self-centered father was suited for a lazy life like that. Although I had thought so somewhere in my heart, I couldn't imagine my father as a stoic writer. At the same time, I was beginning to lose sight of who my father really was. It wasn't an easy feat to accumulate 20 million yen through writing work alone. It wasn't an ordinary effort. Why did someone who could be so devoted to something abandon his duty to raise his daughter?
Come on, isn't it enough? Sign it quickly. What's wrong? You haven't been in touch for 23 years, and now you're saying you want to inherit it?
Of course, I was going to abandon the inheritance. I don't want anything that someone who abandoned his daughter left behind.
What are you doing? Sign that paper quickly. Officially abandon the inheritance.
As I was prompted to sign, my grandfather came and stopped me. My grandfather, who faced Taylor head-on, looked angry no matter how you looked at him.
How dare you come all the way here so easily? I told you not to come.
Father-in-law. Don't be so cold, W. I'm your daughter-in-law, you know?
I don't remember recognizing you. And you like David's money more than David himself, don't you?
So that's not true. It's just like I said at the funeral.
The grudge between my grandfather and Taylor. I had no idea what it was. My grandfather explained it to me as I was bewildered.
It's true that David remarried Taylor. David regretted it. Taylor is promiscuous, spends a lot of money, and hardly takes care of her sick husband.
So that's why it's a lie. Who said such a thing? The lawyer? Hey, Sarah, just sign it already. Abandon the inheritance.
That's impossible. David's will says he will leave all his property to his daughter Sarah.
Will.
I was as surprised as Taylor. It was the first time I heard about my father's will. My grandfather nodded deeply as he looked into my eyes.
Don't worry. The will has not been opened yet. It has to be verified by the court. The reason Grandpa knows the contents of the will is because David read the letter attached to the will.
Father's letter.
Yes. It's written in that letter. He decided to leave all his property to Sarah. And your infidelity is also written there. There are also photos of evidence. David doesn't want to leave anything to you.
Taylor slumped down in disappointment. The words, "there are also photos of evidence," may have had an effect on her. She seemed to have given up because she could no longer escape. I was still confused. Leaving property to a daughter who was supposed to have been abandoned? For what purpose? My grandfather smiled sadly as he sensed my confusion.
I'm sorry for keeping silent for so long, Sarah. Your father didn't hate you and abandon you. He had no choice but to leave you with Grandpa and Grandma because of his illness.
Actually, my father had the same illness as my grandmother when he was young. After his wife died in an accident, he seriously thought about it. If he continued to raise his daughter like this, he would eventually become a big burden for her. And that day could come at any time. His daughter might become a so-called young carer. Rather than letting that happen, it would be better to be hated for life and cut off the relationship completely. It was an extremely extreme choice, typical of a clumsy and unsociable father. Knowing everything, I felt indescribable. I was actually loved by my father.
Taylor, are you obsessed with inheritance because you want to use David's legacy to pay off your debts? Unfortunately, you won't get a penny.
This is the worst.
You must be disappointed. You approached David for money from the beginning, didn't you?
Taylor let out a big sigh. It seems that she hit the nail on the head. She hung her head and went home with a heavy heart. It was the moment when Taylor's debt repayment life, which would continue for many years to come, was confirmed. After Taylor left, my grandfather apologized to me again.
I'm sorry I kept it a secret. I couldn't tell you because of my promise to David.
My grandfather seemed relieved. Only he was feeling refreshed. I was still feeling confused. After all, my father's negative evaluation has been going on for 23 years. It can't be changed easily. It will probably take time. For now, I wanted to read the letter my grandfather mentioned. That's where the story begins. If I'm satisfied with everything, I'll inherit the inheritance for the first time. And then I'll go to my father's grave right away. I'll probably tell my father how grateful I am for the first time. I was looking forward to that moment.